Let's start here. Nehawu essential workers have been legally barred from taking part in the public servants' wage strike, which has in the past week seen non-striking health workers intimidated and barred from accessing hospitals. Patients have suffered as well, with the health minister blaming the union directly for the death of at least 4 patients. Nehawu has even been slammed by sister union, the teachers' union Cosatu. As both unions fall under the Cosatu umbrella, let's speak to Matthew Parks, Cosatu's parliamentary coordinator. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. I'm trying to get an understanding of how Cosatu is feeling about what's happened around this Nehawu strike. I've seen on your website that you absolutely support the legitimate concern about wages in the public sector. I want to get an understanding of how involved Cosatu was in Nehawu deciding it could legitimately strike in the first place. Did you have a say? Did you form part of the sort of coordination saying, OK, let's send the health workers out on strike first, that will have the biggest impact? Or is Cosatu not that involved?
No, good evening, thanks for having me. So look, I mean, Cosatu is a federation of about 16 independent trade unions. So they would run their own sector, they'll run their own campaigns of strike. So they don't need the permission of Cosatu to embark on any strike. So and we won't be involved in day-to-day kind of managing of it because that's an affiliates domain. But of course, we would give support to all of the unions when they embark upon strikes. So SACAO currently has a strike at Macro because they are aggrieved about how workers are treated very poorly by the employer. Nehawu likewise is having a strike in its sector because they are aggrieved about how they've been treated by the employer, in this case the state. So first, Cosatu is trying to manage at times contradictions, and there'll always be contradictions when you're dealing with very diverse unions, very diverse people. I don't think even in a family you can always find common agreement on all issues at all times, and that's fine. So managing it. But look, I mean, having said it, a principled position is that we support all of our affiliates, including Nehawu. We support the public servants who are aggrieved about how they've been shortchanged, been pickpocketed by the employer since 2020. There was no wage increase in 2020. Since that time, they had below inflation increases. And we agree with public servants, like all the workers, on the right to earn a living wage, to have the wages protected from being eroded by inflation. Public servants, like all workers, are highly indebted. They are supporting relatives who have lost jobs, who have lost wages. I think our call is that government should negotiate, come to the negotiating table with Nehawu, with all the other unions at the Public Bargaining Council, find an agreement not only for 2023, see how they can resolve the outstanding disagreements from the last year in 2020, but we need to find a win-win solution. It's no point in government simply imposing decisions and then you leave public servants very disgruntled. This is what happens afterwards.
I think what's come through in the last week is that most people acknowledge that there are legitimate grievances within the health sector. You know, these healthcare workers got us through COVID. They saved lives. They worked often without protective equipment. They did heroic and marvelous things. But equally, it seems that the actions of the last week have not only been criminal, we have seen intimidation, too widespread, I think, just to be the action of 1 or 2 people who've got a bit hot-headed. What is Cosatu saying to Nehawu? Do you have power to rein them in, saying, guys, completely wrong plan? This is terrible what's happening. How did you allow your workers to do that? Or is it very much more hands-off than that?
No, so there are constant engagements on a daily basis between the leadership of Cosatu, its affiliates on all these issues. So there has been a lot of discussions. Just like Nehawu also gets reports from its different provincial, regional structures and assesses what's going on. So we have raised concerns. And we welcome the call by Nehawu's leadership, by its president, by its general secretary, who have said, let's support the strike, let's support the issue of public servants. But I think they've also been quite clear, as Cosatu has also been clear, and all of our affiliates, is that whilst we support the right to strike of all workers, we encourage people to support it, it can't interfere with essential workers who are obliged by law to go to work to take care of patients, because if they don't do so, your nurses, your doctors, your paramedics.
I mean, Matthew, the reality is what we've seen in this past week, and we have multiple reports from our reporters. I have personally spoken to people who witnessed Nehawu workers pulling a child out of an ambulance. These are not isolated incidents. To say you're concerned sounds like a massive understatement. It suggests to me that you have no control to rein in a union like Nehawu that seems to have absolutely overstepped the boundaries of the law, which will do a disservice in the long term for your broader fight for public servants, surely.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're not happy with the violence. We're not very happy. That's why as Cosatu, we came out already last week.
All right, so Matthew, unfortunately, we do seem to have, the picture seems to have frozen. I'm going to try one last time. Matthew, can you hear me? All right, unfortunately, that picture is frozen, but just to recap what Matthew was explaining is that they do recognise the independence of the unions under their federation. He's acknowledged, though, concerned about what's happened in the past week and now saying not happy. Read between the lines. That sounds like things have not gone well within Cosatu. Hopefully we can get him back on the line because there's so much more to discuss. We know, for example, that SATU, the teachers' union, also within Cosatu, has slammed Nehawu for its behaviour, for what has happened. And we know that in any strike, it's possible for someone to get out of line and do something illegal, or for people to infiltrate a strike and cause trouble. But the reality is, it has been widespread. So, Matthew, I understand we've got you back, and I'm so pleased. You were just starting to say that Cosatu is really not happy with what's been happening with Nehawu. And I think people are looking to Cosatu for leadership, because that's been the overwhelming criticism. There's been a lack of leadership in Nehawu to manage this properly. There's been a lack of leadership at government level to let it get to this point. So I'm asking you about Cosatu's leadership in this matter.
Yeah, look, I mean, Cosatu is engaging all the time with Nehawu, and not just Nehawu, because other units are also affected by it, whether their workers are essential or not. But look, I think there are contradictions. The strikes are always messy. Things like protests are always messy. And that's not to say that we can justify any violence. We can't. We can't justify any intimidation or interference with essential workers or with patients. We're quite clear on that. I think that's why we've been pleased that the leadership of Nehawu has come out publicly to say to their own members, we need to manage the thing properly. We cannot afford, as you're saying, Sally, for the legitimate grievances of public servants to be lost in a message which says, what about the violence, what about the intimidation or the vandalism? So it is a juggling act. I think also appreciate there's a huge amount of work involved. I mean, Nehawu is about 117,000 workers who work in the health sector. We have to manage it. But I think whilst appealing for calm, I think government also as an employer needs to come to the table and find a way to address it. We've been warning about this issue, Sally, since 2020, when this Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, walked away from a signed collective agreement. He tore it up. He gave public servants basically a middle finger, went to Parliament, said he's imposing a 3-year wage freeze, and then they got no increase for that year, and subsequently below inflation increase. So public servants have really seen the already quite low salaries being eroded. Now, that's not to justify any violence, let alone if someone passed away, which would be unacceptable. But we need to resolve the situation, because if you just simply pose issues, you lose society, you lose workers in this instance. We need to find a win-win solution that says to public servants, here's how we can address your concerns. Again, to the fiscus, here's how we can avoid collapsing the fiscus. And again, we need to find a way to resolve it, to have calm heads, or not have emotions running out of control, because it can get quite ugly, as we've seen, quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely horrific. And I think that South Africans watching this want to know that union leadership, and I'm not saying there aren't leadership failures elsewhere, not by any means, but that union leadership will take action against the broader Nehawu leadership if it's found culpable of inciting these intimidatory tactics, or against individuals within the union. But I also have to ask, Cosatu's in an alliance with the ANC. Is this agreement worth the paper it is written on? If you can tell me about Tito Mboweni just walking away from wage negotiations, but equally things getting so out of control that we are seeing deadly strikes in the health sector, is it actually worth the agreement you have with the ANC anymore?
Well, that's always a subject of huge and often heated debate inside Cosatu, where some would feel quite aggrieved, feel that it's not worth it. Others would feel differently, that with all of its issues, that it is worth it, and they can point to benefits and so forth. I think our issue is not to wallow in pity, not to fold our arms and just simply give up and say, oh, it's tough negotiating. We're just going to fold our arms and give up. I wish to see how can improve the conditions of workers and their families, workers across the country and so forth, and to keep pushing. So yes, there have been setbacks. Yes, 2020 was a huge problem, and we've raised to the ANC leadership and to government, to parliament, that it is a cancerous tumor inside Cosatu, inside the lines. And if it's not addressed, it is going to get out of control, as we are seeing at times. But the other things we can point to which we have managed to achieve through the lines, like a national minimum wage, benefiting workers, farm workers, domestic workers. During COVID-19, we managed to release 64 billion rand from the UIF to help 5.7 million workers in the private sector. We work closely with government dispense the vaccination program in COVID-19, helping to save lives and livelihoods.
Will you be taking action against Nehawu over these violent strikes?
Look, I think for us is to see how can we, number one, address the root cause of the issue, which is the public service wage dispute. Cosatu has been engaging with the leadership of government and the affected
affiliates. That's not really answering my
how...
question, though. I mean, what we're talking about is criminal acts here. And it is looking pretty widespread. Yes, of course, this all would have to be proven in a court of law. But I think South Africans are increasingly intolerant of people taking the law into their own hands and seeing no repercussions whatsoever. Surely we cannot have a situation in a democratic South Africa where legitimately striking workers decide that it's okay to block entrance to a hospital. Surely action has to be taken within Cosatu. Otherwise, your leadership is not effective. And your legitimate issues will not be dealt with seriously.
Yeah, I think let's first remember Cosatu is not the police. We can't arrest people.
Yeah, but you can lay charges.
You can't take people to court. Actually, we can't. Otherwise, you can lay charge as well. Because we're like you, we're seeing what we've seen in the media or on the ground. So I don't think that's how we can do it.
Disciplinary action within Cosatu, is there a process?
Each of these unions are independent unions. Cosatu is an association of federation of unions. Our approach is to engage with workers, to the unions, to try to resolve issues, and we'll do that internally behind closed doors. We're not going to go publicly and start attacking unions, because then Cosatu will collapse tomorrow. Because next week is going to be a different issue, and some unions might have a different point of view about other issues. There has historically been many times when other unions in Cosatu felt aggrieved when municipal workers went on strike, and their members were inconvenienced when they were going to work. There have been other times when unions were aggrieved when the teachers' union went on strike, yet their kids needed to go to school. So for Cosatu, it is a constant delicate juggling act to try to manage contradictions, to find it, but we do so behind closed doors. We don't go and shout publicly at our unions, but we get them behind closed doors, say how to resolve the issues, how can you relate to the concerns of other unions, how can you also assist the union which is affected, in this case Nehawu, to have the legitimate concerns of its members addressed. But if Cosatu go the route of simply throwing its own affiliates under the bus, they will close tomorrow, and society will be in real difficulty, because society needs a Cosatu to try to manage the contradictions of workers in a way that promotes labor market stability. But again, there's no point of, and we agree that the problem of violence is unacceptable. I can't agree to that. That's why Cosatu, last week, Tuesday, came up publicly and said, let's appeal for calm, no one must break the law, etc. And how is leadership to be fair to them? Went out, and maybe it's not being appeared in the cameras, but they went to hospitals to plead with members to abide by the law. They've issued daily statements stating it time and again as Nehawu leadership, members must abide by the rule of law. But equally, we need to address the root cause of this grievance. If we don't do so, we can oppose the law, etc. That's fine, but we're not going to address the root cause. The problem is going to continue to fester to no one's benefit.
All right. Well, thank you so much for chatting to us this evening, Matthew Parks, Cosatu's parliamentary coordinator. And of course, as we've mentioned, this is not a health strike. This is an issue of public servants' wage. And we do note as well that the Municipal Workers Union, SAMWU, is now supporting the public sector wage strike. So we have to wait and see what happens next. Meanwhile, the